Thanks, Paul, and also thanks to the organizers. There have been a number of people here that have pointed out that first meeting in Lund, which the only thing that I really remember is that someone drove through and actually dug through the fiber cable, and so we had no internet for most of the meeting. So to tell you how far we've come in 7 years of having an open access publisher meeting without any internet. But it really is a privilege to be back and also to be here with you in Amsterdam. The talk for today is going to focus on building capacity for open science, or as was slightly revealed as a punchline, how do we get open practice to stick? Slightly cheekier title for this is to how to make my job a bit easier. I head up science at Mozilla, the same Mozilla that you are aware of in terms of, looking at the web browser and a couple of other initiatives. To give you a bit of background as to who we are beyond just Firefox, this is just by show of hands, who remembers the browser in the bottom corner? Show of hands, anyone that used Mosaic. Okay, good. We see a few. When those hands finally disappear, I'll be very sad. But this is, we are steeped in the tradition of not only Mosaic, but then Netscape, which had a different sort of trajectory through AOL and led into the first creation of the Mozilla project as well as Firefox, really steeped in open source tradition, which again has a lot of parallels with our conversation for today. I work on the foundation side. We are a global nonprofit. The science program is just one program within the foundation, but around the broader idea of web literacy and how to shape communities of practice around online experience. We also have endeavors that focus on doing similar things and bringing open source as well as different communities of practice together in not only journalism through the Ignite Mozilla Open News project, but also efforts that focus on policy now as well as learning initiatives in K through 12. But for the Science Lab specifically, we really work to empower researchers to do more open and collaborative research on the web. The talk today will kind of go through a little bit of background on this, show you some examples that are really pertinent to the discussion that you're going to be having for the next 2 days, and hopefully have some recommendations for you as we move forward. But first, starting with a bit of background, as is probably no surprise to anyone that's here, there has been tremendous movements in publishing. This here is a screen grab from Galileo's work, Sidereus Nuncius, one of the first publications that brought together all of the things that we're kind of talking about now. So moving beyond just the content of the manuscript to bringing together the data and the materials. Granted, those were different in Galileo's time. This is from 1610. So instead of having your code, these were the drawings from when he was pointing the telescope at the sky, but then also detailing the methods and the ways that others could reproduce that work. The link at the bottom of this actually goes to a fantastic paper written by a number of people in the open science movement around data sharing practices. So it's interesting to see that, even though in many times it seems like we have come a little bit further away from this, or we're still feeling a tension, that we do have models to look back to. And it's a pretty cool time to be doing research. I don't need to kind of go into many of the examples here about the radical changes that we've seen in the capacity to do more distributed and high volume research, as well as, endeavoring into new areas. I know that Salvatore will be here, is it tomorrow? So he'll be speaking about some of the advances at CERN, but also, looking at moving into petascale astronomy, things that are going to invite all sorts of reinventions of how we even look at data just by the sheer volume they'll be coming off of telescopes like the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope that's being built in Chile right now in the bottom corner, as well as advances in genomics and in terms of engaging others that are outside of the lab, or whatever the lab environment is for your field. Because I know we have a mix from humanities and social sciences here, not just in terms of bringing research to the people, but also in terms of looking at different ways to do essentially distributed data collection, and at a scale that is, somewhat unforeseen for 5 to 10 years ago. And we also, being an open access scholarly publishing meeting, have seen a real upswing in the last 7 years since Lund in terms of open access mandates, federal and national policies, advances in not only the number of faces we see here in the room from new imprints that have sprung up in the last few years. And so it's a pretty tremendous time to be doing this sort of work, which isn't to say that we're not still hitting some roadblocks. So when we go and we speak about open science at Mozilla and with other sorts of communities that aren't as aware of some of the challenges, they think that we have this all fixed. I like to, for those that are from the States, think of it almost like the calcified pipe in the Drano commercials, that, despite the fact that there is still stuff coming out the other end, it's not nearly as efficient as it could be. And so thinking of the fact that some just have a fire hose in terms of funding, in terms of capacity, in terms of attention at the start of that pipe, that there still are ways that we can help ease access and maximize potential for not only collaboration, but also using work that is already there and can be picked up and run with in more effective ways. Also looking at the downsides of, quality or quantity-driven measurements, such as, the impact factor, the publishing, your publishing record, etc. This is one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons, so I'll let you kind of get to the punchline at the end of it. Works especially well for publishing crowds. But, there are certain ways that sort of behavior, measuring for that sort of behavior, can skew things much earlier on. And one of the areas that we work on at the Science Lab specifically is that sort of pre-competitive space of helping researchers do their work more effectively. But unfortunately, or fortunately in your case, publishing is still the cornerstone that they are measuring their life's work against. And so making sure that we are encouraging the proper sorts of behavior, or at least being consistent. Data, in terms of its release, it's getting much better with some of the open data policies that are starting to come out, but still not nearly there, despite the fact that it's slightly grim to mark death on this graph as well. And beyond that, as was mentioned by our hosts here, and that example is from psychology, we are seeing quite a bit when it comes to replication and reproducibility. This here is the famous Amgen case where the two researchers from Amgen went to go back and see what they could replicate from a number of novel cancer therapies, and were able to reproduce 6 out of 53. And those were therapies that they were hoping to be able to find drugs to go into production to immediately help different patients. And so, what can we do to help move that forward? As well as, especially for this audience, there's a few fallacies of the research system that we're still battling. First, that the published record is the only valid or useful record. I know that we've had quite a number of people in this audience that have been representative of different open access repositories and what have you, but in terms of, where we are directing attention, recognizing that there may be multiple copies or multiple iterations of a work that also can be really valuable in helping to move scientific progress forward is important. And oftentimes when we speak to researchers who are not in these discussions, they don't necessarily view those as being equal weight. Also, if it's published, it's usable. This is something that we've been especially digging into when it comes to now looking at open access, which I will tell you the conversation 8-9 years ago at Creative Commons was very different than it is now. At that point, it was, really what can we get online because, we just need to make sure that it's available. But for all of that content that's available, what value is it if it's not usable? And what does that mean for the different tools and technologies and platforms that many here in the room also run, but that are also available to researchers in multiple forms? Beyond that, looking at some of these examples, and I'll come back to this, there are people that are starting to test these assumptions. And so this here is, by no particular sort of choice. It's a paper that's using the IPython notebook, now known as Project Jupyter. It is allowing for this experiment itself for the various settings in the software to be pulled together with the data through a Docker instance, so a virtual machine. And you can find more out at the link at the bottom, but an example of what it looks like to have executable research that can be from start to finish mapped so that others really do have a better snapshot for what to move forward with when they want to build on someone else's discoveries. Other fallacy, that this is good job advice, that standing on the shoulders of giants is not only possible, but that it's also advantageous, and that there aren't other politics at play. I know many have heard the stories of this quote and some of the other origins of it actually being a means of making a dig at one of his collaborators that he may have scooped, who was a very short man. So when we think about, when we tell others that it's, you need to stand on the shoulders of giants, are we actually telling them something that can be mapped to reality? Is it actually possible for someone to take someone else's work and to build on that effectively in a way that is being rewarded and recognized within the broader system that we're all a part of? And lastly, that there are other ways to get job security beyond just your publication record. I know that we've started to see advances, and I'll talk about a few of the things that we've been helping to prototype around making your data and your code available. There are others now who are also starting with your funding proposal and starting to establish that track record, or your software projects. But thinking about the fact that this is still by far the thing that most researchers are working towards, and if the rest of the wheels fall off the bus by trying to get that published paper, you damn well be sure that that paper is going to be the first thing in their prime eye of focus. So what I'm going to go into, now that I've started to get into a bit of doomsday talk, for the rest of this talk, really start digging into some of the examples of what's possible. And this is largely the function that we serve with the research community, primarily focusing on researchers across a number of disciplines globally, but also engaging with other stakeholders like yourselves to make sure that we're, starting to tie together these conversations. And so some of the things that we've been working on to show what it means when we say science like the web, or on the web, as well as starting to dig into a bit more about what does it mean to make, that case for open? What is that value proposition? How are we engaging with researchers around some of these skills and practices, and how, we can also be doing a bit of a better job? And lastly, once we have some of those bits in place, how can we sustain momentum? And again, we're focusing on the point that I'd really love to get help with to carry it over the finish line, and I think that's where the publishers here in the room come in. So a bit of background. Part of the work when we first set off to create the Science Lab was really around this idea that when it comes to not only open source in terms of the code development and software development, but also in terms of the community practices and the ethos around it. This notion of kind of sharing, collaboration, transparency, that anyone can participate, really starting to look at ways that we can start to bridge some of that history and legacy with the research community, and starting to get them to understand a bit more that they also can partake in some of these discussions. And so showing people what we mean by science on the web, we initially started to look at some examples that really got at this, slightly more modular way of creating tools and programs and also resources. Instead of creating sort of the monolithic platform that everything has to plug into, showing that there is, a value to things like federation, to, having different tools that serve various functions, how those can play well together, and also how different stakeholders can start to come together as well. When we were originally funded by the Sloan Foundation, looking at all of the work that's been done by those in open access, those focusing on open data, tool providers, funders, policymakers, et cetera, there was, we were spoiled for choice in terms of which direction to go, but the one thing that was lacking was really showing how these pieces fit together. And so again, kind of going back to this example from before, putting this in front of researchers that may not otherwise have means of knowing that things like this exist, helping them understand and model their own behavior with others that are in their fields, or showing how this can help affect and advance their work. And I know that some publishers, and we're working with a number of them right now, are starting to play around with, what does it mean for things like this to be submitted as part of that record, or also to be done outside of conventional publishing means to be able to share research more effectively. We also, early on in our existence, started to look at ideas that we could take some of the momentum that was coming about, and also some of the traction around the open data discussions, mirroring quite a bit of what we had from the early open access days, but looking at, how do we get open data to be recognized as a first-class research object, and extended it to something that the Mozilla community knows quite a lot about. And so thinking about what that means for code and for software. 8-9 years ago, when we were starting off the science program at Creative Commons, we framed this as materials, biological materials largely, cell lines, plasmids, the tacit materials. Now focusing on much of that, which, those materials still are quite a part of that conversation, but we are seeing more of this now relying on data analysis, snippets of code, scientific software, especially as we're working in more complex environments across various research teams and universities and at a higher volume and scale. And so we worked with our partners at GitHub and also Figshare for an initial prototype. And the real aim for this was to show that you don't need to necessarily have the secret keys to these bits of software, but you can actually get the APIs to talk to one another. And so the first step in this was to create essentially that glue code that could get those systems to talk to one another. This was created by the head of science for GitHub, our colleague Arfin Smith, and designed to essentially say, okay, stuff that's coming off of GitHub's API, stuff that's coming off of GitHub's system, this is where I want to direct it. This wasn't necessarily specifically looking at Figshare, but we're able to plug in a pointer to Figshare as a data repository on the end. And then going from that to working with many of those actually from the open data discussions, from the dialogue in the last 5 to 7 years around what was the metadata that was needed so that someone who was picking up a piece of data knew the context and the ways that they should be using it. And so we engaged not only with those from that conversation, many of whom have never developed software or know a bit less about that than they do about data, but those that may have been involved with creating the standards like the Miami standard for genomics or some of the other ones in biological sciences, as well as computational researchers from a really broad group, and said, if you could have 5 to 7 things that were attached to your code so that others knew how to use it, what were those minimal things? Knowing that, of course, everyone has additional fields that they would want to layer in, but what are those minimal things? And so we worked with them to create essentially this, drop sheet that would come up when you hit a bookmarklet. So just right up in your browser bar from your GitHub repository saying, get a DOI, or digital object identifier. You'd fill in a couple things about your data set, and we've seen these now just woven into the repository services we have. And then on the other side, you'd get bumped to Figshare where that would get archived. Now, this is just it's a bit of an old screenshot at this point. At the time, in the first few months, there were over 400 views, or now you can look at citations and downloads. But you can see some of the important bits here about not only sort of the license, but your citable endpoint at the end of it. And going a step further about what this means to be able to start nesting the data that is either being generated by the code that you make available, putting that with the actual software or the lines of analysis so that those can be more easily discovered, but also, looking at some of the other components when it comes to preprints or papers, et cetera, that come through. And the objective here wasn't necessarily just to work with GitHub and Figshare and have that be the end-all, be-all. Very soon, that code that I showed you at the beginning, which we, for some reason, called Fidget, that was also picked up by Zenodo. So the ability to link GitHub and Zenodo also comes from this project. And that code is still in existence for other institutional archives to link to as well. And so we want to see what we can do to actually start to create that federated system where it isn't necessarily one copy versus another, but that if you're an institutional library and you want to have an accurate record of the research that's going on at your university, you also can utilize some of these things or know that this is an option to understand a little bit more about how to link your system to some of the other services that are sprouting up on the web. And so that was one of our first prototypes to just start that discussion about getting credit for your code, of viewing that equally as you would with your data. And one of the things that came out of this is we were part of a discussion at the National Institutes of Health. I know Phil Bourne spoke here last year at the last COAS meeting about, how can we weave this into a broader discovery index for scientific software in a much broader sense. And so we've got some ongoing work that currently is being led by some students at the Rochester Institute of Technology it's their capstone project for the course of the year, to dig into, what additional things can we layer onto this so that you can start to see different scientific software projects that are linked together with some common metadata in a way that makes it easier for people to discover down the road. Another prototype, and don't focus on the paper here, the person who created it was just very interested in sex work for reasons that I will leave to him, but also looking at what we can do to take existing tools and add additional layer to it. So raise your hand if you've heard of the open access button. It's an open access conference. I'm hoping we see a couple of hands in there. So there was a researcher, actually not a researcher, it was a developer, my apologies, within Mozilla, not within our team, someone who was working on more of the kind of web development, who came up to us and he said, you know what, I've got this health condition and I'm really frustrated by the research system. How can I help? And so he started to dig into a couple projects. We sent some links his way and he said, you know, this open access button thing, I think there's some potential there. At the time, the button was really there to be a campaigning tool. You hit a paywall, you'd hit a bookmarklet, you'd register your interest on the side. It would kind of look at the link that was there. It would say, you know, before we try and get you access, share your frustration. You know, let's rally the troops. Let's put your point on a map so we can say people across these various countries are still hitting paywalls and they're unable to get access to literature. But then he decided to make it proactive, a little bit more proactive. And so, you know, what he added here was essentially a means of not only pulling from that initial link the author's email address, if that was available, but also a system that would send that author an email saying, you know, do you have another version of this paper archived or available? Would you want to add it to our, you know, essentially system of redirects? And so from here, it emails a request directly to the author. And then it's cut off a little bit there, but it says, you know, we found an open access version of your paper. And it might be, you know, a preprint of some sort, or maybe a published version of the paper without a watermark, etc. Something that might be in a university library. But for the next person who comes and hits that same paywall, it would push up and scrape and see what sort of papers were available. And so this was, you know, just an initial test point to see what can we do to help link some of the various other resources that we have that are hosting all of this content. So various university repositories, you know, repositories that are even outside of that on a discipline level, to start to link and make that information readily discoverable. And the interesting thing from this, you know, in terms of not only teaching what open iterative development looked like, and so there were a number of people that were just watching the project, learning a little bit more about how open source projects operated, and also engaging them for feedback in various levels, also to those that weren't necessarily, again, software developers, but wanted to contribute in some sort of way, but also working closely with the Open Access Button team to push back some of these changes, which now have been incorporated in some of the recent editions of the tool itself. And so it's no longer just a campaigning tool, but also looks at ways that it can better serve those that are stuck. The kind of big project that we're working on right now, which I think is really interesting when it comes to looking at how we can better, you know, look at the roles within a research group. There's a project that's been led by Amy Brand, from formerly of Harvard in digital science, now I believe MIT Press is where Amy is, as well as Liz Allen from the Wellcome Trust, to create a taxonomy of research roles, or roles within, you know, a research group, called Project Credit. Based off of that, we were in discussion separately with those at Biomed Central and also Public Library of Science to say, you know, how can we better signal those contributions of from those that are focusing maybe specifically on that analysis code or specifically on the data collection, because a lot of these roles we were hearing from researchers, you know, they really want to become a research software developer, but they recognize that there's not necessarily in all research labs the same sort of community feel where they actually are seen as a part of that lab. It's either being a scientist or IT still in many places. And so what can we do to help get that credit a little bit more than just the nuance of the first and last author? And so we have a project that was one of the original projects from the foundation around open badges, since we still have this infrastructure which has been made open source and is community-led, to say, you know, what can we do to help bridge badges and seeing them as digital credentials? I'll explain a little bit more about that to help ease this. And so we've also so these are some of the roles that were unpacked in that taxonomy, which has been used for a number of other projects as well. It just essentially gets us a common vocabulary to work off of when we're looking at various roles and how they're defined. The link at the bottom there too is a landing page that also points to some other work, exploratory work that's being done about how to apply badges to the sciences, some led by the Center for Open Science, which focuses quite heavily on the psychological sciences and some additional fields. And so, do have a look at that. But thinking about what a badge indicates, we've come quite a ways from when badges were really heavily associated with gamification or, up-leveling like a video game in your work. At its crux, it really is, a JSON file, so a data package in and of itself that contains information as well as often an image, which looks like, maybe a Boy Scout, Girl Scout badge. But on the back end, there is a really rich amount of information that you can specify to be contained there, including not only the evidencing criteria. So in this case, if you were looking at a scholarly paper, you could actually point to the code or to the GitHub repository or to the paper, having that record that's attached so that you can signal who is specifically working on that piece of work. But then looking at what this means in the broader ecosystem. So this is a project that we've been working on for a number of months, not only with two publishers, so Biomed Central, we're originally focusing with GigaScience, as well as with Public Library of Science, and now looking at actually 3 publishers, because we're also in discussions with Ubiquity Press, but also looking at how we can plug this into ORCID, into author IDs, so that we are creating a more comprehensive way of looking at this, plugged into infrastructure that is already there for our use, as well as some of the open badging infrastructure. And what we're doing with this is not only showing how these systems can talk to one another, which I think is, a good piece of work in and of itself, but also looking at ways that we can get others from the research space involved and also onboarded as, new contributors to open source work. And so we're layering in, which I'll speak about in a little bit in a second, we're layering in some mentorship work so we can use this as not only a prototype to show what's possible, but also a first project for a number of people in the research space. This, don't get too dropped into the details here. The main bit to notice on this side is that once an author specifies a badge or a role, the person attached to it, and the initial prototype will be out later this month. Once the author specifies who did the work for that badge and also the various other components that we were speaking about earlier and being able to point to that work, not only gets generated and issued by our services, but it also plugs into your ORCID ID. So the main objective here is that from a published paper and being able to specify some of those roles, and for START, we're looking at roles specifically around code and data, with the hopes that once we have that model, we can expand that. But then also those data packages will show up in your ORCID profile. And so, in the same sort of way that many have spoken about badging your work as essentially your CV, that it can plug into that in a nice fluid way as well. So getting into the second part of this, really looking at, again, that capacity building component, and it will tie back to some of the projects we've been speaking about. A significant amount of our work at the foundation is really looking at this idea and this notion of web literacy or digital literacy and what that means for various communities of practice. The number of audiences I speak to that still think of it as the Web 2.0 version of this, we are thinking of this beyond just a communication platform, and thinking of it more as something that allows us to work in new ways, in a distributed fashion, at scale, in various, linking together various communities as well. With that comes different means of adding power and performance to what we do, specifically for computational research, in means that just, we're just too expensive or too burdensome for many of us, especially when it came to things like informatics in various fields just a number of years ago. But thinking of web-enabled research as something that really contains these various cornerstones around not only access to the content, but also the tools and the methods that come along with that. Thinking about some of the other broader social aspects around, how does this fit within things around collaboration, sharing, interoperability, and what are the incentives or the social metrics that we apply to that as well. And this list could go on, but really thinking of when we talk about, web-enabled research or open research, that these main components are represented. So, in getting into some of the foundations work, we've been spending the last, few years really digging into, what does learning mean in this sort of digital environment, and what is Mozilla's role in that? So, how can we put some of these ideas into practice around this idea that you should be able to, read, write, and participate on the web? And specifically, what does that mean for science? Web literacy is not necessarily a term that we throw around. It's much more rooted in sort of skills, capacity building, professional development, etc. So don't get too bogged down into the terminology, but really looking at what can we do to help build and support the existing areas where people are doing some of this good work, but also create those pathways for others to do the same. And so when it comes to researchers, what can we do to provide a means for them to get involved and for them to sharpen their skills, to really embed some of these open research practices into what they do, but then also to sustain that by providing means for them to not only mentor their peers, but also engage them at various levels. And so at the foundation level, we've been thinking more about sort of the leadership development component of this and how that impacts various groups that we care about. It really is rooted heavily in this notion of service learning. So when it comes to like a Mozilla pedagogy, again, use that term very broadly in this way, but really about that hands-on participatory project-based learning experience and something that is tied to a broader mission of working on things that really matter. Now, again, for the research space, this is, something that helps, advance scholarly research. For other communities, that may differ, but in service of a bigger goal. And a lot of this harkens back to how Firefox was first created and how it continues to iterate over the course of time. Being able to participate in an open project that is helping to keep the web open is a really strong, compelling reason to get involved. And so what can we do to apply that to the research space? And so thinking about some of the things open source and that community has to offer to science, many of these terms here we've discussed at previous open access meetings, whether it's through meetings like COASP or in the broader community about how can we facilitate sharing and interoperability and integration with other systems in terms of other content, how can we enrich that experience. So amplifying within research and beyond software development, one of the things that we've been working on this past year is a means to help make those norms and protocols for open source more explicit. So when we say working open, or when we say, doing things in an open access fashion, it's not always immediately evident to the people we're speaking to about how to get started or what that actually translates to in practice beyond just publishing in an open access journal. There's a lot more that comes into that in terms of considerations, in terms of working style, in terms of, broader communication skills and a whole host of other items. And so we've been working on essentially a contributor guide called the Working Open Guide, just for now. That may change, but to look at, what are some of the ways that we can map this into really tangible benefits for the researcher around road mapping, around thinking through how you craft your not only maybe software project, but also your research, your community event, etc. And again, how do you engage others in what you're doing? How do you communicate that to a broader community so that you're not the sole maintainer, so you understand where to get help, etc. And we've been working to also help facilitate some of these broader learning experiences, which are rooted much more in the learning that you can have as a community working on specific projects that are either pertinent to your field or, of interest. And so a sprint-based kind of focus to this. And the top two photos are from not only a local sprint that we ran in Toronto, where it was much smaller, about 15 people, as well as the global sprint we've now run two, where we had hundreds of researchers around the world in a number of different cities participating for the course of 2 days to not only link and learn more about other community members that are in different, disciplines and at different levels in their careers, but also to collaboratively hack on some projects around not only open access, tools for their own research, etc. And then we created a project repository that essentially pulls from GitHub, but helps make these more discoverable so that once these events are done, you still have ways of engaging in that discussion, understanding that these tools exist, and finding ways of focusing that attention. The past global sprint that we ran at the beginning of June was over 2 days, all of them are 2 days. We had over 30 cities that hosted physical spaces around the world. You can see just a broad mapping here. At a certain point, we lose the nuance of the map, so bear with me there. And what we achieved with that was a consecutive 53 hours of work. And also, community sort of events. And that was in having all of these sites operate on 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 time scale. So we weren't asking people to work overnight, but really just within those bits there. But, you start to achieve this really nice effect of building out and handing off work and understanding what that process looks like, which is, really advantageous in the way that many researchers do their work nowadays as well. And I have to say, it was a productive 53 hours. So over the course of that, we did have those that came along just to be able to meet new people. And we, of course, want to facilitate that. The social aspect is, in many ways, one of the most powerful draws for this. But some real work got done. New curriculum, new tools. We had the creator of the wiki pair up with Max Ogden of the DAT project to create different plugins for that work. We had a new applied bioinformatics curriculum that was created, new capstone lessons for different groups, and over 100 pull requests were filed, some ranging from genomics and using CRISPR to other open projects like the badging project that saw a tremendous amount of activity. And you can find out more of that at the links at the bottom, and these slides will be shared afterwards as well. So getting to the last bit here, building capacity for this work. So when we talk about wanting to further open access and further, best practice, which is on the sign right behind me, we're hoping to be able to interface with researchers in a way that sets them up to be able to do that more effectively and over the long term. Thinking about the rewards and the incentives and reputation, many here have been involved in discussions not only about how this maps to their own work, their repositories, their publishing interfaces, how to weave in metrics, but also thinking about skills and professional development. When we think about digital literacy in the sciences, a lot of it jumps straight to data science, about data science being the sexiest job of the 21st century. Put that in the list of things that I wish, or that the people that wrote that story wish they weren't quoted to say. But also thinking about how we can start to weave in computational thinking, more participatory work into the way that we do things. And thinking of this and how we can actually get open to be something that researchers see and value, as mentioned earlier in the slides, about how do we make that case and that value proposition, we've found our most effective entry point to be framing this as professional development. Again, I really like Dilbert, so I think this is the last Dilbert of the slideshow. But not only in terms of focusing on professional development, but also in terms of focusing on how researchers interface with data. When we first started the Science Lab, we were working with a certain training program that focused on teaching computational skills for researchers, which is wildly popular and made some really great advances. Even with all of the need that we're seeing for those sorts of trainings, we still hit, and especially when we tried to file grants with, NSF and others around facilitating undergraduate education, graduate education, et cetera, we still hit a block in terms of, I'm a researcher, I'm not a programmer, which is a bit disheartening, but also realizing that when it comes to working with data, it's a little bit easier of a discussion to have. It's harder to refute that you work with data than you are a programmer in your day-to-day job. And so what can we do to start to meet researchers where they are, embed in that a broader experience that shows them not only the tools that they need to advance their individual work, but also sneak in some of the things there about collaboration and working more effectively as a whole rather than just an individual. Because, reliance on ad hoc education, it just doesn't scale. And when we first crafted the program, we were looking at, again, those various events that we could use to jumpstart discussions and jumpstart activity. But if you don't have a way of meeting someone 2 to 6 months afterwards, it's too difficult to master and you lose that initial impact. So in terms of lowering the barriers, so you don't really need to be a wizard to do this stuff, we've been looking at ways that we can start to provide not only the supports for various community members, and some, don't necessarily get involved with the sprints. They may still see that as something that's more targeted towards software development, though we do have things there that involve various sorts of content creation, learning resources, etc. So we also wanted to have something there for those that wanted to just bring these discussions around open access and open science back to their university to start that ball rolling. So we created something which is aptly and very generically named the study groups here. And you can see in this handbook a means so that you can not only have and be part of a group of study group leads across a number of different disciplines, people that are running recurring events at their institutions, but also we kind of preset this with a few different tips and tricks and lessons, as well as a code of conduct and some tips for how to run an effective event over the course of time at your university, weaving this into that guide that I showed earlier about how do you build and sustain momentum there and get that pacing right. And we've seen now, we have over 10 of these right now as we start to focus on really making sure that these folks are aptly set up for carrying this into 2016 before we scale it. We've seen not only semester-long events that have been run, but various things that have not only featured various bits of skills training, pulling from groups like software carpentry, data carpentry, the School of Data, and some of those lessons, but also different sessions that are just co-working sessions, various sorts of code-alongs, invited guest lectures, etc. And some of these are now starting to expand, not only through Asia, but also through some of our colleagues in South America as well. Like I said before, we have these regular sprints, so the global sprints, not only in usually around May, June timeframe, but also the Mozilla Festival, which is coming up in November in London, but also creating the resources so if someone wants to run a local event at their institution, they have the resources to do it. And as I said, with the pull request, but also then working through projects like the badging project to show, okay, if you are running your own project, here's how you can build community and keep conversation going. And one of the really interesting things that our lead developer, Abby Mays, created for this was a very conversational roadmap that exists in the GitHub repository. If you look at the Mozilla Science repository for the Paper Badger project, you can find this in the issue tracker. But one of the really interesting things here is that she's teased out something called Good First Bugs. For those of you who've used GitHub before, you can set tags, like just same to how you do in WordPress or any other sort of blogging interface for various bits of content. And so she's gone through and she's tagged a few different things that she needs help with for the project. And all of these issues are mentored. So if you are brand new to software development, but you want to get involved, she and other members of this project, which spans a number of different universities as well as publishers, will help you get up and running. Because that sort of affirmation of being able to get something over the finish line is so strong and oftentimes is exactly what's needed to get you to come back again. And this is a very bad snapshot of a project call that she runs on a regular basis. So again, communicating this out as well as working to make sure that this is documented and something that gets put into some of the workshopping that we're doing with other researchers so they understand how to get one of these project calls to share out where they're stuck and how to build momentum around their project, how they can do that themselves. We also have a fellowship program which is starting. We're in the final selection process for this, and we'll have 3 researchers within their universities joining us for 10 months. These are paid internships. This is $60,000, healthcare, childcare, to be champions of open data and open science within their institutions. And really, again, going back to that service learning idea, really rooted in the notion of not only having that time to work on their own projects and to be recognized and supported for that, prestige, funding, all of that sort of motivation, but also really there to help build and catalyze the momentum within their communities and create the resources to help their peers do the same. And so this is something that we're also looking at in terms of incentives to help make this a little bit more prominent. And there are other events that happen around the world that bring together not only diverse mixes of folks from the repository space, university researchers, and others. And this is one run by the University of Melbourne in Australia. So lastly, we need your help, or more so, I need your help in terms of helping to make sure that we are being sort of consistent across what we're asking of researchers and how we can help them really understand the broader benefit of this work and keep it something that's, valuable, advancing their work and they're being recognized for, and thinking beyond open access and really looking at usability. And what does that mean? And having that discussion more broadly. Also not being afraid of sort of open source collaborations. Now, we're not here to make product in terms of our team specifically, my colleagues, yes, but we're not here to make product, but there are a number of different tools that are being developed and also, bits of repository infrastructure, bits of sort of review and editing tools for the community here that are designed for your disposal and not duplicating those efforts and instead understanding how to interface with them instead, as well as remembering the non-technical challenges. The incentives for researchers, especially around publishing, you hold a lot of that power to dictate what that behavior looks like. And we could really use your help in finding a means of closing that feedback circle. So I will leave it at that. We're here to help, and we would love to get you more involved with that and also find ways of supporting your work. You can find out more about us at the links that are up there and reach our team at sciencelab@mozillafoundation.org, or you can reach me directly. Thank you again.